I am the Director of Design at SnapRaise, which is a local startup that does fundraising for high schools, as well as we have a college side that does giving days for colleges. So that's SnapRaise and Snap Advance. And yeah, so I'm here to talk about how product management and design is like peanut butter and jelly. And you guys all have the distinct privilege of being my first public talk. So if I do anything weird, that's why. All right, so before we get into kind of the details, I'm going to set some kind of like basics here. So when you're talking about design and collaboration and different departments, what you need to start with is a solid structure. So the ideal structure is sometimes used the metaphor of a three-legged stool. And the point is you have product management, you have design, you have engineering, and those are the legs, the three legs of the stool, right? So if any of those are underserved or not listened to, your stool gets wobbly and it might even fall over. So the stool is kind of the metaphor for the product. And where PM kind of sits in this is we have technology, business, and design. And engineers fall pretty well into technology, design, obviously designers, business, stakeholders, you know, like your CEO or anyone that you work with in like sales or anything like that. And then product management ends up in the middle. So it's kind of like by definition is you're the generalist among specialists, which puts you also in an interesting position because usually you work really closely with design and engineers in a team. So while you're a generalist, you also tend to be the person who is advocating for business the most out of those three. So just a little caveat here. So this is based on my experience. And one important caveat here is I have not worked at a very huge company. So like I haven't worked at an Amazon, I haven't worked at a Microsoft. So you may find that some of my advice doesn't work for you, doesn't apply. That's totally fine. I think you just need to look at your unique circumstance and where you want to go and what you're interested in doing, and then take what's useful, and you can pretty much ignore the rest. So getting into it, how does PM and design collaboration actually work? Well, the first thing you need for collaboration is just trust. Also, this is one of my favorite icons. I think it's very cute. I'm very happy I found it. But trust is really important from a PM perspective towards design because PMs they're an influence-based position. So that means that typically the engineers and the designers don't report to you. So they're not reporting, like you cannot fire an engineer, you cannot fire a designer. They report up into their managers. You work with them on a team, right? So you have to get them to do the things you want them to do, but you can't force them to do it. So you have to lead through influence. And the fastest way to getting that influence is building trust. So now we can get kind of specifically into designers. So designers want to know the why. They want to know, why is this important? How does this help the user? Why do I care about this? Why does the user care about this? You know, so there's a technique in user research that's the 5 whys. And it's the idea of when you are interviewing someone, you ask them, if they give you an answer that you don't understand, you ask them why 5 times. So the idea there is it gets down to the real reason why they said what they said. So you can kind of think through that in terms of when you're trying to communicate something to a designer, you really have to get down to the core of why it's important. And usually you can do that by focusing on the user. And you should teach the business. So like this is maybe less applicable to say if you're working in an agency, but when you're in-house, learning the business is something that your designers should care about and that you should help them learn how your business works. How does sales work? How does your company make revenue? You know, all this stuff is important for the designer to know, or else you're going to get pushback on weird things that you don't understand why they're pushing back on. And you're there to support and guide them. So designers appreciate that support, especially for things that they don't like doing, which might be on the more technical side. And then this is a little tip as well, which is if you want to collaborate with designers and build trust, allow them to present their work. So presenting work to stakeholders, having them really own what they did will really make them feel appreciated. So this also has the caveat, if they want to. So some designers are shy, they don't want to present. You can do it. That's totally fine. But if they're interested in it, then I highly recommend it. And you can limit it to just the design, right? You don't have to let them present the whole thing, but presenting what they worked on will build a lot of trust. So when you're collaborating, you also need to understand the resources that you have. So it's really important to figure out what the skill level is of the designer, because that will tell you what they're capable of doing. So a junior needs more hand-holding, does best on small tasks, has probably limited communication skills, maybe is too nervous to present, usually not super self-motivated, going to be waiting, so you need to do a lot of pushing them. And then they also work best with a lead or a design manager. So if they have someone in the design perspective to really help them identify what they need to do from a design perspective, that's the best. If you don't have that, you just have a junior resource, you guys are going to have to just kind of figure it out as you go on. So for mid, they should be starting to understand the business side. They should be good at communicating. They should take initiative. They may also provide you interesting insight. So if you really work with them in terms of understanding the business, you may get little nuggets of gold from them where they are thinking about things in a very different way than you're thinking about them. And that's where kind of design really starts to shine. And then they should have an opinion on the product. So the weird side about this is your juniors will probably be easier to work with than your mids to seniors. People are going to start to be more annoying as they get more experience. Because they're going to start disagreeing with you, and they're going to start pushing back, and they're going to start asking why more often. And then when you're talking about trust, that's when you really, really, really have to make sure that you're explaining things appropriately. If you're lucky enough to have a senior resource, then you should expect a great understanding of the business. They should be learning it on their own, even if you're not teaching it to them. They may take tasks that you give them and redefine them. So we'll touch on problem statements as well. So this is a way to avoid someone taking your task and turning it into something else. They should be rather self-sufficient, and they should provide some innovative ideas. So it's maybe something that's completely out of left field, but be very good for the business. And then thinking holistically, they should think about the whole product and not just about a screen or a widget. Is there any questions on this so far? Yeah.
That last slide was from the kind of product manager's perspective of the designers. Do you have the reverse later on?
Like a product manager from a designer's point of view?
Yes.
What the skill levels are? Yeah. So I guess if you were to switch this around and do PM, a PM is probably a junior PM is probably going to have trouble identifying the why. So it's probably going to have a little bit trouble articulating why things are important. They're going to tend to just kind of I call it just do it tasks. Can you just do this? Can you just do this? And give them to you. And yeah, and probably just going to be, if you're a more senior designer working with PM, then you're probably going to have to lead a little bit. So you may have to kind of fill in some of the gaps there by increasing your business knowledge and helping them discover the why, right? They may not know. For mid, it's kind of mirrors, they should be good at communicating. They should be able to communicate to you what's important about what they're doing. They should use more things like problem statements rather than just do it tasks. So instead of design this screen, it's users can't edit their profile. Right? So obviously we need an edit profile screen. And then the mid will also, that's probably where you start to see them teaching as well in terms of the business. And then senior should be someone who is going to be creating roadmaps for you, giving you a good idea of what the high level vision is for the product, and really kind of helping you and empowering you to really be an expert in your area. So you should, ideally, senior PMs shouldn't hold you back as a designer in terms of just trying to get you to do what they want. A really good senior PM will kind of make you feel like you're even more efficient than you are without them. Okay, so if you're a PM, then there's usually, PM is very similar to design, and you can come at it from all different ways. So you want to think about what kind of PM are you? Are you really business or user or tech focused? And then look at your resources and decide who can even you out. So who can be I'm really tech focused, but these designers are really helpful in making me think about things like user experience that I never thought about before. Like, why is it important to have human readable errors? I didn't think to make that a task, but it is very important. So we kind of touched on this. So overlap between design and product. So these are the things that a designer can do, and the more experienced or precocious they are, the more likely they are to want to do these things. So things like identifying when they don't know enough about the problem statement, they have to go talk to more stakeholders, or even writing documentation. So one of the things that we do is we use envision prototypes, and then we comment on them for certain functionality that's not visual. So you wouldn't be able to say, tell what's in a drop-down without like a list of it. So you can expect more senior people to think of that and then proactively do it. Okay, so when you're thinking about documentation for design, always be outcome focused. So what do you want out of it? So it should be a goal. It shouldn't be design and profile edit screen. It should be allow users to customize their profile so that in our case, in SnapRay's case, if you add a profile picture, more people donate on your page. So obviously that's a very good reason to have that. And then it just doesn't need to be very prescriptive. One of the things is that design identifies solutions and engineers execute. So it makes sense that engineers want more technical prescriptive documentation than design does, because design is a little bit more in the cognitive like ideation space, where once you get down to engineering, it's like you just need to execute on it. And then always explain the why. So problem statements are incredibly useful. So this is a common template that I use, which is user struggles with problem because reason. So, donor struggles with the checkout because the errors don't tell them what's wrong, right? Something like that. So instead of writing it like, you just improve the errors on the checkout, because then it's like, well, why? And then this is best for kind of low, mid to senior levels. Sometimes junior designers have a hard time figuring out what to do with problem statements. You must understand the business. So the designer needs to understand the business side of this. And then it's great because it's non-prescriptive. So as a PM, you're going to be identifying the problems. You're going to be taking the problems to the designer, and then the designer is going to identify solutions for that. So that really plays to non-linear thinking strengths. And if you are a PM, you're probably a pretty linear thinker, because you're probably like very organized, and you're thinking through like the roadmap, and you're thinking through features, where design can kind of like play around and think about it from different perspectives. All right, so some of the things that I ask some of my PMs that I work with, what things are most helpful for them. And one of the things I said is actually prototypes, obviously. They're amazing for stakeholder communication. If you're trying to tell someone the feature does this, this, and this, it's just a picture's worth 1,000 words. If they can click through it, if they can like have in their mind how it actually is going to work, communication is so much easier. And pretty much any level should be able to provide this for you. And then the other one being something like a user journey or service blueprint. So a service blueprint is something that UX designer will do where they'll go out and do research, and then they will put swim lanes out in terms of like the technology and the people who are interfacing with the product, and they'll put the actions in it, and you'll see the whole entire flow. And the thing that's really helpful here is it identifies pain points. So what we have down at the bottom here is an actual design deliverable that my designer created for our warehouse. So these are all stages of warehouse, like printing, weeding, masking, shipping, pressing, picking, and all of those have pain points that are then prioritized by how important they are to the users. So you can understand how useful this is from a PM perspective. So it's like your designer went out and did all this work for you. It's really useful also for creating empathy. So things like user journeys and service blueprints allow people to see a really big and usually pretty complicated flow and understand it and grok it pretty quickly. So it creates empathy on a team. And then it also helps the designer become more familiar with the business. So if you're talking about teaching a designer business, then like make them go do a customer journey or service blueprint. Like sometimes the best thing to learn something, or the best way to learn something, is to teach it. So this is what I call hard mode. So I've done this before with my PM, which is that if you give a designer multiple problem statements, so you could even especially if you have problem statements that have no customer value, only business value. So we have problems staffing this position because of the seasonality of our business, and we want to find a way that we can reduce the costs there, right? So that doesn't mention the customer at all. But if you combine that maybe with a customer problem that doesn't have any business value, combine them together, then you can get something that both has business and customer value. So this is something that I would expect more high, mid to senior level designers to be able to do. It's essentially this nonlinear thinking of connecting multiple problem statements. But that's a really core value in terms of like someone who really understands the business and understands their customers will be able to do that. What? Okay, we're already done. So, all right, so any questions on that or anything that you'd like me to go back to and talk more about? Yes.
So you mentioned earlier that on average, engineering tends to be a kind of point and shoot, give them the spec, let them go with it. That's sometimes true. In my organization, that tends to be more of a architects want to design with you, even some dev team leads want to design with you. I'm just interested to know your
That's great. Yeah, that's really great. So you'll find the same progression that we were talking about in terms of junior to senior with engineers as well. And then more senior people tend to also be more collaborative. So you'll find that more junior engineers are not very interested in collaborating, and they're kind of more focused on like, I just want to be heads down engineering, But if you're lucky enough to have an engineer that's wants to work with you, then that's like, you struck gold. Like, that's great. And I think that's absolutely going to give you a better product if you can involve the devs earlier. And one of the things that we're working on is actually getting it so we're not separating design and engineering. So right now we kind of have, like, it's agile, but it's a little bit waterfall, where we have the designer doing the designs and we kind of pull in the devs as needed. And then it kind of does a little bit of a handoff and then goes into engineering. But what would be more ideal is if it was all just happening at the same time. And then the engineers are more invested in whatever the designer's working on, rather than just kind of after the fact. Yeah?
In the previous slide, you said business problem and customer problem. Can you please elaborate on that a bit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what would be an example of a business-only problem versus a customer-only problem? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a business problem would be something along the lines of like operations problems. So kind of like if like our business has a warehouse side to it. So if you have a business problem, which is like we have people are unhappy in the warehouse and we have a hard time retaining the people in the warehouse, right? So you may if you solve that problem, you may improve, say, like quality of like what's going out, but it's not as focused on the customer. Where if you had something like, let's see, a customer problem, you may have, I can't think of a customer-only problem right now. Does anyone want to?
What would you say that the main difference is?
Well, the main difference is something that customers care about versus something that the business makes money on or is good for the business specifically. I'm trying to think of the example that I've used before, but it's completely, yeah.
So then, how do you say value? Could you describe how it leads to value?
Yeah. I'll give you an example of that I've actually done before. So we have this concept of a game plan call, which we do. It's basically onboarding. We have interns call our customers and help them onboard. So what we had the business problem of wow, that's really hard to staff for. And we had the customer problem of like, nobody wants to talk on the phone, right? So people weren't picking up, like they weren't even picking up the phone. We had like a 40 to 30% answer rate, you know, so the business is staffing for this. It's not getting the customers value. It's kind of like annoying the customers actually, because you have to go through this whole scheduling thing. So the customer's not really getting that much out of it. Like if you answer the phone, maybe you get a little, you onboard, so maybe you're more familiar with the product. But otherwise, like nobody's really getting value out of that situation. So what we ended up doing was designing a digital onboarding, so that we could replace the game plan calls with. So the idea being, okay, let's take something that was kind of a chore that for everyone, and that was just like a walk through the product and try to insert some customer value. So what we did was when you're setting up the page, we actually have suggestions for how to write the content on your campaign page so that it's more personalized and your donors understand why you're raising money and then they donate more. So we are now looking at, okay, we don't have to staff as many interns for these calls anymore. So that's a business value, right? So now we're reducing costs on the business side because we don't have to staff these people anymore. Then we've got customer value because the customers are now getting more money from their campaigns because their campaigns are more effective. Right? Which also that is also giving value both on the customer side, but also on the business side, because obviously we take a percentage from what's raised. So when our customer makes money, we make money. Did that answer your question for value? Yeah. So usually it basically boils down to, is the business making more money? Is the business more efficient? You know, is it more scalable? That sort of value. All right. Yeah?
So maybe a little elementary, but I've never worked with designers before, but I may have to in the near future. So as a PM, what do I look to my designers for, and like what can they do for me as a PM, and what do I shout to them for?
So what would you expect your designers to do for you as a PM? Yeah. Yeah, so that would go back to the idea of taking stock of your resources. So when you do work with those designers, what level are they? Are they junior? Are they mid? Are they senior? And then that will determine what you can expect from them. Generally speaking, if they're more junior, you should expect kind of smaller tasks that you have to be a little bit more prescriptive on, and you have to really guide them through the process. If they're more senior, then you should treat them more as an asset that you should like collaborate with, and they will give interesting ideas, and you should work with them and say with problem statements, you know, that way kind of like a little looser hand. I mean, you're always there to make sure that they're solving a business problem. It's not like designers are perfect. Sometimes they get carried away and they start doing things that are not at all what you intended and may not actually bring value to the business. So as a PM, it is your job to keep them on track. And that's also another reason why I really like problem statements, which is that you can ask, is this solving the problem? And just bring them back. Like, I know you're really excited about this feature, but does it solve the problem? And then that makes it really easy to prioritize, because you can cut things really easily when you know, hey, that's a cool idea. It's probably a good iteration, but it's not solving the problem. Does that answer your question? Yeah? All right. Cool. Anyone else?
I was just going to add to your answer, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm a designer, so we should chat if you want. And quite often, like our PMs will, for juniors, they'll give quite a honed-in problem statement. It'll be like, hey, I want you to design this screen on this. Like almost that level, like they would have done the wireframing in their head, and they said, go design the screen. But for the senior, like for me, quite often what they'll say is, they've got this problem. Like the customer experiencing friction here, I think. Go and prove or disprove that first, and then come back to me with some ideas. And normally what they want in the ideas is not just, here's a series of solutions, but quite often because there's engineering and there's cost involved, they'd like a small solution to that problem, a technically low cost solution, like a medium, and then what we call a blue skies or a super realistic way of fixing the problem. if you ask for that, though, just be careful that you don't always pick the small one, because otherwise the designer won't bother doing it.
Yeah, and yeah, that can be demoralizing if they never feel like they're getting to be creative or really explore what the possibilities are. Because that's really what designers get into it for, is they're creatives who like the big picture thinking. And so a lot of designers tend to want to be involved in the strategy side of it. Anyone else? Anything that I like totally didn't cover at all, but you think I might be able to answer? Yeah.
So I'm a content strategist writer, and say that's your fourth leg of the stool.
There you go.
Yeah, sure. I find that it's very helpful for me to working with the product managers with all the amount of data that you can provide, that you have all the tools for and the training to read and understand better than sometimes design or content, because that's just not our focus. But I find that really helpful when we're working with you and talking about the data and understanding how to read the data and how to make some theories about the design based on what the data is telling us. So that's another way that I think product managers really shine, as far as really educating the designer on how to read data. Yeah, that's a really good point. That personally, I do not like dealing with data. I like it to be wrapped up and handed to me, like, oh yes, this is interesting now. But like getting into the product, like whatever tracking and trying to figure out everything can be quite challenging from a design perspective. So yeah, that's a great call out. Yeah. Anyone else with something that we didn't talk about at all you like to talk about? Yeah.
So you said human readable error messages. That was interesting. So is there anything other than UX examples like that where designers would have to put on examples that they would contribute to?
So an example from a non-UX perspective?
Like I guess error messages are also kind of UX, but not design page UX.
Like a visual designer or something?
Are there any examples of other things that designers
Well, I mean, yeah, so product managers can work with all types of designers. So yeah, you have like people who more tend to work in, say, the marketing side that might do more kind of graphic design stuff. So I think those people also really benefit from hearing the same things that you would tell a UX designer, which is like, why is this important? Why should you do this? And then things like having the content, especially when you're talking about marketing, because when you're talking about like a really feature heavy application, you're kind of focused on the features, right? So there's content, but it's not as star of the show as like with a marketing page. And I think that it's really important to make sure that you have the content before you start designing when you're talking about something that's very content heavy, because like, what are you designing otherwise? You're just making things up. Like, I don't know, maybe there's a carousel here and maybe there's like an icon with some text under it. And what is the text? I don't know. So PMs can definitely work with, graphic designers or content creators of all types. Yeah. Did that answer your question, or you were looking for something more specific? Yeah, okay, cool. Any other questions?
How did you get to be, how did you end up being a product manager, and what do you appreciate most about that position?
So I am not a product manager,
Oh, that's right.
but I do have, people keep telling me that I have product management skills, which I think I learned when I was at an agency. So working at an agency and having to interact with clients a lot, and say like working with a project manager, there's a lot of unanswered questions that kind of come up that you have to seek out yourself. So I think I learned a lot from that experience, and then brought it into when I moved in-house, still kind of having that view of like, what problem are we actually trying to solve here? Because what you'll run into, clients are like really terrible PMs. they just want to tell you what to do. Like they just want to be like, you are my conduit into Sketch and just do what I tell you.
And what they like and what they don't like.
Yeah, and it's all about like, oh, well, I hate the color
I don't
purple.
like that color.
Yeah, and you're like,
This
Okay,
has
so
to
now I
be
have to
wrong.
find out a very gentle way to tell you that your opinion doesn't matter. Like, okay, this should be fun. One of the things that I mastered was the no but. No, we cannot do that, but we can do this. So I think product management and design overlap in some really interesting ways in that the more senior you get in both, the more you will find like you're kind of doing the same job. So that can also be a source of conflict. And I think that what is really important for a good collaboration is to care about what the other person cares about. So if you're a PM and every day you're trying to explain the business to people and explain why this is important to the business and why this is prioritized over that, and your designer does not care about that at all, and the only thing they care about is making the users happy, and your prioritization is stupid, you're gonna have a bad time. But if the designer understands the business and they care about that, then they know where you're coming from and they can respond and compromise. And it's the same way in the other direction with engineers. Like if the designer doesn't care about the feasibility of what they're designing, again, you're gonna have a bad time. Yeah. So it's helpful, I think, in my position as the director of design in trying to view the legs of the stool equally, right? And try to value them equally. Go ahead.
You kind of mentioned that from like a cadence and collaboration standpoint between designers and engineers, that like you kind of tend to work up like do design up front and then break that down and then go execute, where certainly a more collaborative and iterative approach throughout would be better. Have you had successes in kind of getting to that more synchronous cadence, and can you speak to that experience?
It is very challenging, and I think that you find the most success with doing it with more senior people because they tend to be okay with more ambiguity. So actually my coworkers are here. This is Joseph and Tyler. Joseph is the director of engineering and recently been working on some projects where we are kind of like almost redesigning while he's building, which sometimes he gets really mad at me because he's like, great, everything I worked on last night is gone now. And I'm like, you're welcome. We literally did that this week. Yeah, exactly. So we'll do things like, one of the things that I really enjoy is called a jam. So it's a collaborative brainstorming session that we do as a kickoff. And we invite any devs that will be working on it, any stakeholders like from support, sales, marketing, that wants to be part of it, and we write a problem statement as well as a how might we. So how might we blah blah blah, right? And then we just spend 5 minutes sketching. So everyone gets like some colored pencils and stuff and just sketch it out. And then we go around the room, everyone shares, and then the designer gets all that stuff and kind of takes it back. And then we do a prioritization with the PM, the designer, and the dev to figure out of those ideas, what is important, what's solving the problem, and what is feasible to build in like our time frame, So that I think does a very good job of being pretty collaborative. After that, it's harder to get them to work together. So if like Joseph and I are working together on something, there's just moments where he'll just like come in and be like, this doesn't work. I'll be like, okay, whiteboard, let's do this, And so I think it's just being open to rethinking what you thought was done, like at any point through the process.
On both sides.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because sometimes, and this happens a lot because it can be really hard to articulate abstract concepts, but maybe engineering starts building it and it doesn't work at all, right? Like what you were trying to accomplish as the designer isn't possible with, say, the way that it was architected or, just like the basics of how it works. So sometimes you do need to go back on the drawing board on both sides. The problem with going back to the drawing board on the engineering side is it's much more expensive. So you always got to take into account the fact that engineering has a very big job to do, which they have to take everything that up to this point has been conceptual and make it real life. So it's just exponentially more work to do that. At every stage it gets more expensive. So you just want to make sure that if you're wasting someone's time, you probably want to waste the PM's time. because every stage of that gets longer to produce and more expensive for the business.
There's a recurrent theme that I'm picking up here, and all these things that you're saying, which was maybe one of the reasons why I didn't remember that you're a designer and not a PM, is working on purpose. That you're goal-directed and outcome-focused.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's about how do we get there in serving a purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. So you always want, everyone should be outcome-focused. And goal-focused because, I mean, we've seen this at SnapRaise, which is in 2018, we had a lot of just do it tasks. Just like, just do this. So even last week we had a task come in that was like, can you just add this Vimeo video to the campaign page? And we're like, okay, fine. Like, it's the deadline. It's gonna help with this test. All right, we'll do that. And then they come back and they're like, there's a bug. We're like, what? There's a bug? Like, yeah, the tracking doesn't work on it. It's like, okay, well, that's like a feature request. That's not a bug, you know? So it's still like, if instead of giving us the just do it task, like just put a video on the campaign page, well, that's not all that you wanted. You wanted to do a test where you wanted to show users a video that had some content that was important to them to motivate them to donate, and you want to test what content is most effective for achieving that outcome, right? So then when you phrase it more like that, you're like, oh, you probably want tracking on this. Yeah, that's probably a core feature of this project. So I've just found, like, working, if you're not outcome focused, you're gonna be wasting a lot of time doing just do it tasks and then fixing what you did for the just do it tasks. Yeah.
So you had a nice diagram earlier of a kind of Venn diagram between what a product manager does and what a designer does, and there's quite a lot of overlap. And you also mentioned that as you get senior in both of those types of roles, the overlap kind of gets more. I'm interested on your opinion of what stays outside of the overlap, typically, even with it on the senior level. Because obviously, I've been called a PM before, right?
Yeah.
Not really, but if I look at the set of responsibilities, it kind of gets pretty damn similar.
Yeah.
So yeah, what do you see as kind of system for a product manager skill, like a designer would never do, for example?
Oh, from a product manager perspective? You know, I think that visual design is pretty specific to designers. I mean, that's where we came from, right? We try to make it pretty. Make it pop, as Joseph says. I've banned him from my office several times for saying that. Yeah, so I would say probably visual design. I mean, I'm trying to think of another example there, but yeah, anything in the kind of graphic design, visual design skill set where you really have to have a visual background, because PMs tend not to be really deep in that. But I mean, you can have a PM that started as a designer and then switched over. So it's, and PMs, you know, they're the generalist, right? So if they're working on a team that has no design and they have design background, you know, they may end up just doing it because they got to get it done, they got to get it shipped, you know, and they may be the most qualified person. I think from a PM perspective, I was going to say maybe writing tasks, but even I've had my designer write tasks, so yeah. Probably road mapping, I would say, is something that is typically outside of what a designer would do. I mean, I've done stuff from a director of design perspective where I think about what are the design initiatives that need to be done. So outside of what the business wants to do, which is usually focused on new product, right? New features, new shiny thing. I'll also be thinking about okay, well, how are the users going to navigate to the new shiny thing, right? How are they going to be onboarded to the new shiny thing? What about the old thing that's broken that we need to go fix, you know, because it's still core to our business. So I'll do some things in that area, but I would probably say the typical designer doesn't touch as much on the road mapping part of it, which is pretty prioritization heavy and pretty business heavy. Yeah.
And on that note, some of those kind of design priorities, if you will, would be potentially things, right, like design systems or streamlining and optimizing kind of the overall, continuity and flow and all of that. Have you had examples where you're able to quantify the business value of that kind of initiative?
Mm-hmm.
That, I think, is the kind of thing that often is difficult to prioritize in
Yes.
terms of like, polish or, when it is compared to like the new hotness.
Yeah. There's certain things that I'll want to do from a design perspective, like purely from a design perspective, but then I'll go searching for reasons why, other than design, it's good for the business. So a good example of that is I have a weird relationship with Snap in that when I was working at an agency, I actually designed the MVP. So when they invited me to come on about 4 years later, I was like, wow, you guys haven't changed this design at all. It's exactly the same, which is part of the reason why I wanted to join, so I could update the design. And, so I have this personal agenda that I'm bringing with me, and I'm like, gotta get everyone off this terrible old design that I'm ashamed of. And so it's a very design perspective. I know that, yeah, there's usability improvements, the business has changed a lot, but it is hard to kind of make that argument. So what you could do is look, talk to your engineering counterpart and figuring out, okay, maybe this code, maybe like the design, the code has not aged well either. And maybe if you switch everyone over to a new version, you can collaborate with the engineer to make sure that it's more scalable, it's more efficient, the code is better quality, and then that's going to lead to just way more efficiencies on the engineering side. So taking that back to how expensive engineering is, if you've got, as Tyler likes to call it, a lot of load-bearing CSS on your edit page, say, for example, it becomes impossible to edit some of these old, very tech debt heavy things. So you can do that through kind of driving efficiencies through others. There's also the approach of if you can move it, just demonstrating the value. You have to, I think PMs are really helpful here with the data side, where you can say, I want to make these improvements. How do we track whether it's making more money or, it's better for the users? And yeah, so tying it, the business is always going to care about revenue. It's always going to care about efficiency, and it's always going to care about scaling. So you can also make a kind of more general argument, which is that in the same way that tech debt eventually is going to grind you to a halt, UX is going to do the same thing, but for your users. So you're going to see loss of retention specifically, and probably a lot of problems with your onboarding. So if your business is having problems in those categories, you can try to, make that argument. That's it's probably because you have a lot of UX debt, and users don't like this experience.
Or we've piled on so much now things don't make sense, where maybe once upon a time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
Can I throw in a kind of related example to that kind of endeavor? I do a podcast about content strategy, and I interviewed a woman at Microsoft recently who heads a team of 30 content designers, and on the Azure and AI studio over there, which is huge, 1,500 products or so, and she would manage to embed content designers in 30 UX teams, and she could demonstrate. So she has data galore, she has a whole range of products that she can work on. But she demonstrated that by embedding content designers in these teams, and she had A to B, apples to apples comparisons to make with similar product lines, she improved usability 94%, improved, I forget the other metric, it was something like task failure rates declined 44%, NPS went up 8 points. So she did, so that, and I would love to see, that's a very narrow and specific thing, but I would love to see more people doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah, one of the challenges is, you can always look at conversion rates and things to do with revenue. That's easy to track. It is design that's really hard to track. So one of the things that we started doing was actually called pure UX scoring, which is essentially a heuristic evaluation done by 3 people that then go through a flow, and each step of it, they rate it 1 to 3. And then you get a score at the end in terms of how usable was that flow, right? And then you color it for the worst score that you got along the flow. So it's either going to be green, yellow, or red. So it can show you, because essentially red means that there's a point in the flow that was so difficult that people would drop off, right? And no part of your flow should it be so difficult that you can't finish. So if you do something like that and you start to create some numbers, if you can just generate numbers around it, and then you can show the progression. So sometimes it's just about finding what is the number that you can put to the usability, or like the design polish, how does it affect your brand, right? If things are looking janky left and right, which you could maybe do with surveys or something like that. But you are getting into the subjective, which is harder to convince businesses.
To kind of like translate that back into development.
Yeah, totally. All right, yeah.
From your perspective, if you could touch a little bit more on how marketing's role works in all of this.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously every organization's a bit different, but I noticed there's like a blurred line sometimes an evolution of like product management and marketing. I was curious how you help us play together and how maybe shifting and moving.
Yeah, so the question being, how does marketing play into this whole ecosystem? So there's obviously the position of a product manager, right? And their job is to really like market whatever is being created by the product. And I think in the best collaborative senses, they'll be part of coming up with that. Like marketing can be really useful to design in that, they do things that are really similar. It's like creating personas and understanding the market. And even, from a sales perspective, what even has maybe perceived value, even if it's not that valuable, but it's highly useful in terms of getting people to come onto the product that maybe UX designers wouldn't think about, because maybe it's a perceived problem rather than a real problem for the customers. But it doesn't matter if it gets people to sign up, right? So there's the product marketing side of it. And currently what we do is the marketing is kind of outside of the team. And we do communicate with them, and we do like go-to-market meetings every week and try to coordinate how they're going to explain it. It's kind of specifically for the sales, because we have a distributed sales team. So there's a lot of communication there and a lot of training that needs to be created. So if you're working in an environment where you're trying to be very agile and iterative and release and deploy a lot, that can be challenging, because there's only so much that people can absorb in a short frame of time. And then that, I think, is where that relationship with marketing becomes very important, because you have to understand like what the cadence is that they want to be teaching and releasing, and putting out content that helps with the success of the product, because it's not always the first person who makes a great product wins. Like marketing is a huge part of making sure that you have a successful product. If nobody knows about it, nobody's going to use it. Did that answer your question, or you want something more specific?
Like it's maybe more on the like marketing and sales is almost like, obviously true marketing is driving awareness, driving traffic into the product and usage. So it sounds like that's kind of how it delineates in your organization.
Yeah, I mean, it's separate in ours. Truthfully, I think if you could have a cross-functional team that has like the content strategist and the marketing expert and the designer and the engineer and like everyone, like an established stakeholder from all the departments, like I think that's the best. Like that would be the perfect way to do it. But when you're trying to make a cross-functional team, you have to make sure that the departments that you're trying to work with are ready for that. And, it kind of depends on how your company works. So are they ready for that?
I think to add to that is that like kind of understanding like what they need when, and getting aligned about like, if I give you information earlier, I have to kind of trust you that you're not gonna
jump the gun
and like that's for context, that's for information. So I've kind of found that like, because people generally would rather know sooner rather than later, and so like even with ambiguity, so like if they know that things are ambiguous and subject to change, I think that people can kind of flex and react to that a little bit better, as long as you're aligned about like this thing is coming and it may change and pivot along the way, and then it's kind of just refining that, but they at least know roughly what it is, and so they can kind of start strategizing versus like dropping a completely finished thing and be like, okay,
this is done.
About this, but here it
market
is,
it.
great.
Yeah,
So
nobody likes that.
I think it's like that setting that expectation about like, this is what I know and this is what I don't know. So do with that what is appropriate at this juncture in time. So.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. A good call out. Yeah.
I would add to that as well. So we have like different wings in our building practically, so like engineering and product management, and then marketing and salespeople kind of yeah, it's like there's a big, concrete door in it now. We're kind of separated. Marketing and product marketing were kind of separate for a very long time. So we did a couple of things to build trust with them, because they were going off and marketing the product in a way that was very different to how we understood the product, like some years. How did they come up with that? Because we weren't really talking to them, there was a lack of trust there. So one of the things we did was we did a customer journey map, like in that area with a couple of those guys. So they could see that this is why we're working on these things in the product and not the change of the icon or whatever they wanted to do. They could really see the problems. But what also came out of that we didn't expect was they could feed back into product management, into UX, which is what I'm in. Hey, we've got all of these telemetry points that might be useful to you from our marketing efforts, from our video marketing, from whatever it is, content. And that's actually helped us to identify things we need as well. So that customer journey map exercise just had so much in terms of trust and also just helping the product management as well.
Yeah, love customer journey maps. There's the great way, because you can't send everyone out to talk to your customers. Like, you have to figure out who's going to do that and then communicate it effectively. So yeah, I love that UX documentation stuff. It's great. It's great from pretty much everyone's perspective. Cool. Any other questions? Thoughts? All right. Sweet.
Hey, let's see.
Thank you guys.